we are here today with gardening educator Mark Lyons. He is going to talk to us about preserving the harvest. This is probably kind of one of our last gardening programs here at the library for the season, but we are already making some fun plans for the spring, including the return of our annual seed swap, which is going to be in late January. I believe January 28th is National Seed Swap Day. So if anybody wants to come and swap some seeds with us, that will be happening in a few short months. All right, so I'm going to let Mark go ahead and get started here.
All right, thank you very much, Megan. That's actually the second best introduction I've ever been given. The best was once no one was around, I had to introduce myself. So I'd like to welcome everybody to Preserving the Harvest. This is a presentation all about taking all those lovely garden vegetables that you worked so hard to grow, and now you've got so many of them that when you try to give them to your friends and neighbors, they start barring their doors, and it's when they see you coming. They say, this is the time of year you have to be sure to lock your car doors, because if you don't, you might find zucchini in your back seat. But when your friends and relatives can't take any more and you've eaten as much fresh as you can and you made enough gazpacho and spaghetti sauce and ketchup and you still got lots left over, what are you going to do with it? Well, that's what we'll be talking about today. Little bit about me. Megan mentioned briefly. I've been doing I've been doing gardening for about the last, since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've been preserving food now for the last 7-10 years or so. I got my start in gardening when my parents had a vegetable garden. They were kind enough to let my sister and me sharecrop a portion of it. And as we got older, I started taking over more of the labor, and now my mother gets all the tomatoes and cucumbers she wants with no work on her part. What's not to love? In addition, I have 6+ years experience as a management consultant, which essentially means that I'm qualified to tell people what to do. And lastly, I have a BS in agriculture, and as everybody knows, for a successful garden, it requires a lot of BS. And in fact, I would have to say that this year has probably been one of the best years for gardening, because this is an election year, and Lord knows there's been BS all over the place. So, what we're going to talk about today is, there we go. It's me. We're going to talk about, first of all, how to choose the right ingredients for your food preservation needs. We're going to talk about some different methods of food preservation, namely canning, drying, freezing, pickling, and a little bit about cold storage. And afterward, I'm going to ask everybody to hold their questions until the end of the presentation, so we have time to get through everything. And then at the end, I'm going to encourage everybody to go home and start preserving that harvest of theirs. So let's talk about choosing our ingredients. First thing you want to keep in mind is you want to use only the freshest and best quality produce that you can find. The vegetables that you use should be young and tender, because the older they get, the more tough and fibrous they are. And they're not as good for canning as they are when they're younger. When you pick vegetables or cut herbs, they undergo changes almost immediately after you pick or cut them. The vitamin C content decreases, for one. If you can't process your harvest for preservation right away, if you pick it off of your garden yourself or you get it at a farmer's market, then immediately after harvest, refrigerate it. The exception to that is tomatoes and herbs, which should be kept at room temperature. Now, an alternative to refrigeration, if you can't refrigerate them right away, or if your refrigerator's all full, is to set up a sink full of water with ice cubes and soak your produce in that. This is good for short periods of time. If you know that you're gonna be doing your canning, your freezing, or whatever within the next 1 to 2 hours, this is a good short-term holdover to keep that stuff fresh until you're ready to work with it. After you soak it, you want to wash off any remaining dirt. If you're going to be preserving thick-skinned vegetables like squash and cucumbers, you may need to scrub those with a soft brush to get any lingering dirt off of them. If you buy your produce from a farmer's market, never buy it during the hottest part of the day and leave it in the trunk while you're running other errands, because the heat can cause all that stuff to wilt. If you can't go home right away after getting your vegetables at a farmer's market, bring a cooler with you and store the vegetables there. You do not want to use supermarket produce for your canning, your food preservation, because many supermarket fruits and vegetables are imported from faraway sources. And as a result, what you buy is not going to be as fresh as anything that's grown locally or that you grow yourself. In addition, foreign produce may be grown under less stringent requirements for pesticide use. So personally, I don't want a side of spectricide with my pickles. Also, locally grown produce tends to be higher than supermarket produce in nutrient content. Because remember I mentioned earlier, as soon as you harvest fruits and vegetables and herbs, they tend to lose quality and lose nutrients right away. And produce, you got to figure that these things that have traveled for thousands and thousands of miles before it reaches your table, they've already suffered a significant amount of nutrient degradation. And in fact, tomatoes are especially prone to this. By a show of hands, how many people here just love the fresh, flavorful taste of a store-bought tomato? I'm not feeling the love on this one. Well, of course not, because store-bought tomatoes are grown not for freshness and quality, they're grown for transportation. They pick them green, they harvest them, they store them, they ship them across the country, then they gas them with ethylene in order to get them to turn red. So what you've got is something to survive transport, but is not very fresh, not very flavorful, and really not all that good for preservation. Also, locally grown produce, as I kind of alluded to, has a better taste, appearance, and scent. Let's talk a little bit about the ingredients you're going to use in preserving your food. First of all, salt. Salt, you can't get away without salt in preservation because salt is used, number one, to add flavor. If you're canning meats or seafood, salt acts as a preservative. The kind you want to use is either canning salt or pickling salt, because this is pure sodium chloride. It has no fillers and no additives. You do not want to use any of these. Table salt contains a filler that eases pouring, but causes cloudiness in the canning process. Also, the iodide that's in regular table salt can darken the foods being canned. It won't necessarily detract from the taste or the flavor, but it just doesn't look very good. Sea salt is expensive. And once again, the mineral content can affect the color of your finished product. Solar sea salt is not food grade. It's used for water purification. That's the stuff that you put in your water softener. It can promote instead of retarding spoilage in canned meat. Dairy salt is for animal feeds, for animal consumption, not for human use. Halite salt, that's the stuff that they use in the wintertime to melt the ice on the roads. You don't want to be using that in your food preservation. There are salt substitutes like potassium chloride, there's Morton salt substitute. This really isn't good for food preservation because it can leave an unpleasant aftertaste in preserved foods. Spices. Best kind to use are whole, fresh spices for food preservation. Older spices confer no benefit. The best sources for spices are mail order outlets and health food stores. That's where you'll get the freshest, best quality. If you've got spices that's been sitting in your spice rack in your kitchen for ages, I wouldn't use those. They're really not going to give much benefit. You want to use your spices whole because if you grind them up, this can cloud the finished product. So in order to use them whole, what you'll do is you'll tie them up either in a cheesecloth or butter muslin bag, or just take a square of cheesecloth or butter muslin, bring the ends together or put your spices in the middle, bring the ends together, tie them up and soak them in the sauce or whatever it is you're making. This prevents the darkening of the finished product and this intensifies the flavor. Herbs. I've been asked, what's the difference between an herb and a spice? The difference is that spices are usually grown for their seeds and flowers and other things, whereas herbs are grown more for their leaves. With herbs, you can use them dry or you can use them fresh, but you don't want to use dried herbs that are more than 6 months old. You want to keep them in airtight containers to reduce any kind of flavor loss. Now, many supermarkets sell fresh herbs, but you can also grow your own. However you purchase them, be sure to choose the best quality, and again, use them as soon as possible. You want to choose herbs that are going to impart a good flavor to your produce. And if you're not sure, what kind of flavor an herb is going to do, you want to test it in fresh food first before you use it in preservation. One good way to test out an herb is to mix up some butter, put a little herb in that, put it in the refrigerator for a few hours, and take it out and you can spread it on bread or just taste it directly and see how that tastes. If you like the flavor, then it's probably good to be using it in food preservation. If you don't, then you probably don't want to use it. Some common herbs that are used in food preservation. Dill gives a subtle flavor in fresh foods, but when you use it in the preservation process, this tends to intensify the flavor of that dill. You can use both the foliage and the seeds. Basil gives a sweet flavor to tomatoes. Other things like parsley, oregano, garlic chives, and cilantro are also good with tomatoes. Cilantro is especially good to use in salsas. Unless, of course, you're one of those people that have a genetic predisposition against cilantro, which makes it taste like soap. Once again, another good reason for testing out the herb before using it in food preservation. Sugar. Sugar adds to the color and texture and flavor of foods when you use it in small amounts when you're doing canning or curing or freezing. Best kind of sugar to use is good old table sugar, white and refined, 16 calories per teaspoon, either from cane or from beets. You can substitute other types of sugar if you wish or if you want to experiment. In your handouts, there's this same table that's on the screen here. Just how to use other sugar substitutes, how much to use in relation to table sugar. You do not want to use any of these. Aspartame, or under the brand name of Equal, the heat of the preservation process will destroy the components of the aspartame. You can use aspartame only for uncooked freezer fruit recipes. You can't use it in anything else that you're going to cook. Saccharin carries an FDA warning label as a possible health hazard. Saccharin is used in commercially canned products, but it's not suitable for home canning. And sucralose, which goes under the brand name of Splenda, sucralose may offer some promise in home canning, but it's still relatively untested. Again, if you want to give it a whirl and experiment with it, you're welcome to it, and maybe it'll come out good. But if you're making a whole bunch of stuff and you don't want to, discover after you canned about 12 jars of jelly or jam or something that it tastes horrible, and you've just wasted all of that, I would stick with just good old table sugar.
But not stevia or monk fruit or agave?
Once again, you can experiment,
Right.
but
Because it's more of a natural thing. So it just says it was on your picture. So I was just wondering.
yeah. Once again, if you're doing it
Yeah.
for the first time, just stick with regular table sugar. Now, if you're trying to make a sauce and you want to thicken it, here's some different ways that you can do that. Flour is the usual go-to standard for thickening. But if you heat it too long in the preservation process, it can result in a very runny sauce instead of a thick sauce. Agar can be used in uncooked sauces to thicken it. You can get it from health food stores and Asian food markets. Agar is also the stuff that they use in petri dishes to grow bacteria. Clear gel is a modified food starch. It produces a smooth, heavy-bodied sauce that doesn't gel upon cooling. Clear gel is resistant to breakdown under high temperatures and low pH conditions. It doesn't leave a starchy aftertaste, and it leaves an excellent sheen in your finished sauces. And it gives canned foods a greater shelf life stability and a smooth texture with no liquid separation. Clear gel is not suitable, however, for freezing, for frozen food. And I've mentioned cornstarch there, which is another good thickener to use, but cornstarch can leave a starchy aftertaste. Water. The best type of water to use in food preservation is good old distilled water. Because tap water can contain large amounts of minerals, and that can affect the quality of the finished product. If you get your water from wells, for example, the sulfur and the iron in that well water can darken foods, and also it doesn't taste too good. Also, the calcium or magnesium carbonate that's in tap water can cause your vegetables to shrivel up. Also, if you suspect that your tap water might be have microbial contamination, don't use it. I mean, the heat of the canning process might kill off enough of the bacteria, but you don't want to take any chances. Now we get to the scary part of the program. Safety. Safety is the primary consideration in choosing preservation methods. Well, I don't have a picture of it up here, but in your handout, there's a nifty little picture of the Clostridium botulinum bacteria. That's the stuff. Clostridium botulinum is a bacteria that grows under anaerobic conditions, absence of oxygen. And when you can stuff, what you're doing is you're essentially driving the air out and creating a vacuum. If you're not careful and you don't make the canning liquid acidic enough, or you don't use enough heat, that bacteria can grow and grow and produce the botulism toxin, which can make you very sick or even kill you. So leave botulism toxin or Botox to those people that want to smooth out their wrinkles. That won't do very good for your insides. Now, most fruits are acidic enough to be canned in a water bath canner. Anyway, most fruits are acidic enough to be canned in a water bath canner. Vegetables that don't have the acidity of fruits and others you have to use vinegar, in a pressure canner in order to kill harmful bacteria. Flavor is also another important choice in your preservation method. Strawberries are best preserved by freezing. You don't want to can those unless you're making a strawberry jelly or jam. Apples, however, taste better when stored in a root cellar. That's our cold storage. So we'll talk more about that in a little while. Canning, let's talk about that one next. The whole reason for canning is to preserve foods for long periods of time. What you're doing when the canning process, you're destroying spoilage microorganisms and you're storing them in a vacuum in which most bacteria, with the exception of the botulism one, cannot grow. Let's talk about the things that you're going to be using for canning. Jars. Don't try to do your canning in commercial glass jars like mayonnaise jars or pickle jars. Those lack the sturdiness of your good old mason jar, which is what you want to be using. Also, they may not be able to withstand the high temperatures in a water bath canner or the high pressure of a pressure canner. You want to use clean glass canning jars, your good old mason jar, that are free of chips and cracks. That's the only kind of jar you should be using for canning, not anything else. Each jar must have a two-piece lid. There we go. You can't really see too much here, but this is the lid. It's a flat disc, which contains like a little gel-like substance. And this is the ring, which holds it on there. The screw ring will hold that vacuum lid in place. You can reuse the screw lid. You cannot use the vacuum lid. After you've emptied your jar, you have to throw that top portion away. Canning jars come in many different sizes, but in general, the half pint, the pint, and the quart-sized jars are the ones most commonly used. Those fit best into home canners, whether it's a water bath or a pressure canner, and most recipes will call for those particular jar sizes. You want to make sure you match your recipe requirement with your jar size before you start. This will affect the quantity to jar ratio and the time for processing. The finished product will also determine your jar size. You want to use wide mouth jars for foods that are packed whole, like peaches or cucumbers. Small mouth jars are more appropriate for relishes, jams, jellies, chutneys, that kind of thing. The jar should be about at least 4 inches shorter than the height of your canner. Boiling water bath canning. In boiling water bath canning, what this process does, it submerges packed canning jars filled with a highly acidic, raw, or blanched food. It submerges them in boiling water. This brings every particle of food to temperatures hot enough to kill any molds, yeasts, and bacteria that can cause food spoilage. Also, the boiling water bath canning method drives air from the jar, which creates a vacuum that then causes the rubber-coated lid to form a seal. You can only use the boiling water bath canning method for highly acidic foods. These are the foods that are suitable for boiling water bath canning. Once again, I mentioned Clostridium botulinum, which grows in a vacuum. It can grow to fatal levels in an anaerobic, non-acidic environment. Clostridium botulinum exists in nature, but normally you don't see a lot of it in fresh foods because it's out in nature where the oxygen is. When you do your canning, you've taken away the oxygen, now that bacteria can grow. That's why you need the acid, vinegar, or any other acidic product to kill that bacteria, and the heat as well. If you do it right, heat and acid and vacuum should kill most any other kind of spoilage microorganisms, and the heat and the acid should take care of the botulism bacteria. All right, let's talk about pressure canning. Now, with low acidity foods, as I mentioned earlier, the bacteria can grow in the canning process. What pressure canners do is they create high temperatures in low acid foods, which can kill even the toughest microorganism, including the botulism bacteria. These are examples of low acid foods. This includes all vegetables with the exceptions of tomatoes, and tomatoes actually are a fruit, believe it or not. Now, vegetables like pickles and sauerkraut, which are generally made in a high acid environment, those can be done in a water bath canner. But everything else, meats, seafoods, if you're making mixtures like soups and things like that, those are best done in a pressure canner. Now, there's two types of pressure canner equipment. There's a weighted gauge, which regulates the pressure precisely. You don't have to check that annually for accuracy, which is one of the advantages, and it tends to be less fragile than a dial gauge. A dial gauge canner, you have to check this annually for accuracy, because if the gauge is high by more than a pound, at say 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure, you run the risk of over-processing the food. You can have the accuracy checked. You can take it to your local cooperative extension office. They'll check the accuracy for you. The main advantage of a dial gauge canner is that you can increase the pressure in 1 pound increments. And this is essential if you're canning foods at high altitudes. That's the slide I was looking for. Here are some other methods of canning which have been done in the past, like maybe your parents, your grandparents. The safety of these is rather questionable because foods have to be high in acid with a pH of 4, 6 or below. Foods such as fruits can be naturally high in acid, or you can add acid in the form of vinegar or anything else. You want to make sure that you use an up-to-date, research-tested method of canning. The FDA in general only approves either boiling water bath or pressure canning for food preservation by the canning method. These, as I said, have questionable safety. This is a steam gauge canner. Again, it doesn't get hot enough, and there may not be enough acid to kill the bacteria. Your oven or your microwave or your dishwasher, just no, those are not safe. Now, some people might say, well, my grandmother did steam canning and it was all right with her. Well, we know more now, and you want to be sure to do it what's going to be the safest way possible, scientifically tested, because if you don't, once again, you run the risk of poisoning yourself or anybody else that eats what you've canned. And that, friends, is what's in your handouts. Once again, safety is paramount because you've got large amounts of water, enzymes, bacteria, mold, and yeast in foods. As I said earlier, this Clostridium botulinum bacteria multiplies in the absence of oxygen. And if you don't have the proper canning method, if you don't have enough acid, if you don't have enough heat, you can wind up with a very dangerous product. For safe canning, you want to start out with clean hands, clean food, and clean equipment. You have sturdy produce like zucchini or other things, you might want to scrub those with a vegetable brush before you start processing them for canning. If you have delicate fruits like blueberries or strawberries, you want to soak them in several sinkfuls of water and then lift them out with a colander or a strainer. If produce has peels like apples or pits like apricots, you want to pit those first before you do any canning. Raw fruits and vegetables, you want to soak them in a gallon of water mixed with a teaspoon of ascorbic acid or lemon juice. This prevents the fruits or vegetables from darkening. You want to start out with clean jars, and if the recipe calls for a processing time of less than 10 minutes, you want to sterilize those jars in a boiling water bath canner. Now, if the processing time is going to be 10 minutes or more, you can wash the jars in soapy water or wash them in the dishwasher. That should be enough to clean them. You want to keep the lids hot in a saucepan of boiling water because you want to make sure there are no bacteria on them as well. If you're using a boiling water bath canner or a pressure canner, you want to be sure to clean that too. The gauge and the petcock in a pressure canner, you want to make sure that there are no food particles or anything there. It's a good idea too to make sure you clean everything after you're all done as well as before, because that way the cleaner the better. There's two different kinds of canning. There's raw pack and there's hot pack. Raw pack canning is used mostly for high acid foods and delicate foods. Your jars are packed firmly with room temperature food that's been cleaned and cut. You want to pack one jar at a time, allowing for headspace and adding very hot liquid. And the processing time also tends to be longer than hot pack foods. You want to fill your jars one at a time. You want to use a canning funnel or a ladle, like you see. Something like that. You want to beware of any dripping liquids when you remove the funnel because it'll not only burn you, but it can ruin the seal of your jar. You want to take a clean paper towel and run it along the edge or a tea towel before you seal it. Then you want to put the lid on, make sure it's nice and secure with a metal screw ring, and then do each jar one at a time and then use a jar tool to firmly close it and tighten it. You know, when you fill your jars, it's important to leave some space between the liquid level and the top of the jar because the heat of the vacuum will cause the liquid to expand, which drives out the air and forms a vacuum, which will seal the jar. And you want to make sure to follow whatever recipe you're using in order to have proper headspace. If you have too much headspace, then the top level of the food can discolor. If you have too little, food can push out of the jars during the process and then the jar won't seal properly. Altitude can affect your processing time because here at sea level, Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. The higher up you go into the mountains, the higher altitude you have, the less temperature, the lower temperature at which water boils. So you're going to have to adjust your processing time in a pressure canner to account for whatever altitude you're at. Otherwise, the water won't be hot enough to kill the bacteria. And that's when our arch enemy, the botulism bacteria, rears its ugly head. Also, at higher altitudes, steam expands more in the headspace in a pressure canner. So you want to increase the headspace by 1/8 of an inch for every 1,000 feet of altitude above sea level, not to exceed 1/4 of an inch for half-pint jars, 1 inch for a pint jar, and 1 3/4 inches for a quart jar. You want to select the correct processing time. Low acid foods, use a water bath canner. You want to process the jars for the correct number of minutes in a water bath canner. You want to cool the jars at room temperature, and then once again, be sure you're adjusting the processing time for the altitude that you're at. In a pressure canner with low acid foods, you want to process the jars with the correct time and pressure for the altitude that you're at. You want to let the canner cool at room temperature until it's completely depressurized. The internal temperatures of canners tend to be lower at higher altitudes, so you're going to have to increase that pressure once again if you're at a higher altitude. Also, air trapped in the canner can lower the temperature and result in underprocessing. This mostly can occur in dial gauge canners, which don't vent during the processing. So to be safe, you want to vent the canner about 10 minutes before you start the processing. And then you want to check the seals afterwards. You want to press your thumb down on the center of the lid. If the jar doesn't give, if you don't hear a clicking sound, then the jar is properly sealed. If 1 or 2 of the jars aren't sealed, all is not lost. Just refrigerate those jars and use the stuff inside in a day or 2. You can also test the seal by lifting the thing by the lid. So you can take off the screw ring and just try to lift it by the lid. If it holds, it's properly sealed. If it falls down and you got the lid in your hand, it didn't seal properly. All right, next method we'll talk about is drying. What drying does is it takes most of the moisture from whatever it is you're trying to preserve. Without moisture, this stops the growth of any harmful microorganisms. So to prepare your food for drying, one method you want to use is blanching. What blanching does is any enzymes that are in the vegetables or fruits that can cause spoilage are basically inactivated. What you're doing in blanching is you're heating the food, but you're not cooking it. If you're going to dry vegetables and fruits, the only recommended method is steam blanching. This preserves both color and nutrients. In your handouts, there should be directions for blanching. What you're basically doing is you're heating up the product, whether it's by steam or boiling water, and then you're plunging it into cold water in order to stop the process before it completely cooks. There's 4 different ways that you can dry food. There's air drying, sun drying, using a dehydrator, or doing it in your oven. Air drying is basically accomplished by allowing puffs of dry air to circulate around the food, absorb moisture, and then carry that moisture away. In order to prevent color loss, you have to keep the food out of the sun. If you're going to dry green beans, for example, you can string them on a cotton thread, using a needle and thread, just like from your sewing kit, and then hang them under the eaves of your house or on your porch. If you want to dry mushrooms, the needle and thread method also works. You want to use a string with a needle and a cotton thread and then hang it in any area location. Also, you can dry it on paper towels. You want to use several thicknesses of paper towels and then place the vegetables or mushrooms on there. You want to turn it several times throughout the day and then changing the towels as needed to make sure all the moisture is absorbed. After you dry them, whether it's the green beans or mushrooms or whatever, you want to heat them in the oven at about 175 degrees for about 30 minutes to destroy any insect eggs that might be on them. This will condition the food, and then you'll store it in a dry place for about 6 months. That's how long it'll be good for. Sun drying takes a little bit more time, so this is where you have to blanch it first before you dry it. The ideal conditions for sun drying are a temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit and less than 60% humidity. If you don't have these conditions, you have to be careful because low temperature and high humidity can cause the food to spoil before it dries. So on a hot, humid day, that may not be the ideal conditions for drying your vegetables. To do sun drying, you want to take an old picture frame, clean it with soap and water. You want to seal it with mineral oil, then stretch a clean 100% cotton sheet or cheesecloth over the frame, then attach it with a staple gun. And then you want to arrange the food on this frame that you've created and put it out in the sun to dry. You want to cover it up with cheesecloth or another screen in order to protect it from birds and insects. And then once again, after you've dried it, you want to freeze the food for 2 to 4 days or heat it in a tray in the oven for about 10 to 15 minutes at 175 degrees. A dehydrator can be very easy to use. All you do is follow the directions, place the food on the trays that come with the dryer, turn on the dehydrator, set the timer, and then remove the food when the timer runs out. Things you want to consider when you buy a dehydrator. Number one, it should be UL approved. You want to buy a size that's right for you. If you have a small garden and you're not doing a whole lot of dehydrating, you don't need a huge dehydrator. It's only going to take up space and you'll be wasting most of the space there. If you have a big garden or you buy a lot of stuff from the farmer's market that you dry, then a larger size might be appropriate. And the trays that come with that dehydrator should be lightweight and sturdy. Plastic screens are also easier to clean and they don't corrode like metal screens. Also, if the dehydrator has a door, make sure that it opens and closes easily and that you can remove it. The dehydrator should have controls for both airflow and heat, and it should be easy to read. Your dehydrator should also be easy to move, clean, and store. The dehydrator should also have double-walled insulation. You want to try to find a model that's energy efficient, uses less electricity. And you want to check to see that consumer advice and repair service are easily available. If it's hard to get help and you find that it's not working like it should, then you may have a little bit of trouble. In order to oven dry, using that method, you want to preheat your oven to 145 degrees. And since not all oven dials are accurate, you want to check the temperature periodically with an oven thermometer and then adjust it on your controls as need be. Temperatures can vary, so you may have to experiment. You know, the dial on your oven may say 145 degrees, but if you check it with the thermometer and you find that it's not, you may have to experiment and find adjust it to whatever the dial says in order to get that 145 degrees or more than what the dial says. Then you want to prop open the door with a wooden spoon to let the moisture escape. Now, many ovens also have, you know, a gauge or a gap where you can just close the door and just open it slightly and it'll stay open. So you may not need to use a spoon. Then you want to place your food either on oven racks or you can cover them with 100% cotton sheeting or cheesecloth. One factor in using drying is don't try to do too much at one time because this lengthens the drying time. So just do a few, you know, allow enough airspace so it's not too crowded. You want to allow 4 to 12 hours for drying, depending on the number and types of food items that are being dried. Then when they're dried, remove them from the oven, let them cool. When foods, you'll notice you did it right because the food should be dry and pliable when it's cool. After you're done drying, whatever method that you use, you want to condition the food by pouring it in a large open container, a container that should be made out of enamel or stainless steel. You don't want to use any containers made out of aluminum or one that's porous because that may adversely affect the dried food's flavor and consistency. Then you want to put whatever container you're using in a warm, dry place that has good air circulation, and then stir it around 1 or 2 times per day for the next 10 to 14 days. This is how you condition your dried food. Depending on what you're using, you may want to use pasteurization. This will give you partial sterilization. If you want to preserve your food longer than the 6 months recommended for regular drying, then pasteurization is definitely recommended. There's 2 ways you can pasteurize. You can do it by heat. You want to spread the dried food on trays on a thin layer and leave it in a 175-degree oven for 10 to 15 minutes, then let it cool. This will pasteurize your food. Or you can freeze it. Put it in plastic storage bags, put it in your freezer for about 2 to 4 days. This degrades fewer vitamins than using the heating method. The freezer has to be at 0 degrees Fahrenheit in order for this to work. The freezer compartment of your refrigerator may not be adequate for the job. You may want to purchase a separate freezer that's dedicated to pasteurizing or freezing foods, and we'll actually talk about that just a little bit. If you want to dry meats, meats are dried in a similar manner to fruits and vegetables, except that the drying temperature has to be 140 to 150 degrees in order to prevent that meat from spoiling. Also, the USDA recommends that all meats must be cooked to an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit before you dry it. In order to obtain the longest possible storage time, which is that 6 months, you want to use only the freshest lean beef and then store the finished products in resealable bags in the freezer. Lean beef or lean lamb is the best meat, the most reliable for drying. Pork and chicken contain too much fat for successful drying. If you try to dry pork or chicken, the fat can turn rancid and present a health hazard. Talked about all of that. Freezing. What freezing does is those frozen below 0 or below temperatures can prevent spoilage by basically stopping the action of microorganisms. Microorganisms contain a lot of moisture. Freezing causes their activity to slow down. It doesn't completely stop microorganism growth, but it slows it down a heck of a lot. You want to make sure that when you freeze, whatever container you use, whatever packaging you use, is airtight, because oxygen and moisture loss are the main enemies of frozen food. Ice crystals evaporating from the surface of the food can cause moisture loss, and this is what results in freezer burn. Freezer burn can dry out frozen food and make it tough and flavor compromised. In order to prevent freezer burn, you want to make sure that whatever you're using, bags, wrapping, is moisture proof and vapor proof. You can use clean glass jars for freezing if you allow, once again, sufficient headspace, just like you would in the canning process. The best packaging for freezing food is a zip seal bag made of thick plastic specifically designed for the freezer. Now, let's talk about selecting the right freezer for you. You want to consider 3 things. How much space do you have in your house? If you don't have a lot of space for a freezer, you don't want to buy a big model. How energy efficient is it? Because if you're going to be doing a lot of freezing, you're going to be drawing a lot of current that's going to raise your electric bill considerably. And how accessible is it? You want to make sure that you put your freezer, again, where you have enough space. And your freezer also should be easy to access, especially if you're going to be filling it and emptying it for quite a bit. In other words, so if you want to put your freezer in the basement and you're going to be using it a lot, you're going to be getting lots of exercise going up and down the stairs. Now, if you need to lose some weight, this may be a good thing, but it may get kind of old after a while. You're going up and down, emptying, filling. If that's going to bother you, you want to put it where you can get to it easily. You want to make sure, once again, to purchase the right freezer, because this can save you money. Freezers have to be kept at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or lower in order to prevent that food from spoiling. You want to make sure to buy a separate freestanding freezer. This is going to use less energy than what your refrigerator freezer can use. Also, large freezers use more energy than smaller freezers in order to stay at 0. And it takes more energy to cool air than solid matter. So you want to make sure that your freezer is going to be full as much as possible, because a half full freezer is going to use more electricity than a full one. Once again, this is why it's important to make sure that you get a freezer that's the right size for you. If you have too big a freezer and you're not going to be filling it very often, then you've got all that airspace. You're just basically freezing air, and that's going to cost you big bucks. Self-defrosting freezers tend to cost about 60% more to operate than the older manual models. If you have a manual defrost model, you're gonna have to check it frequently for buildup of ice. When you see that ice reaching about a quarter of an inch thick, that's when you're gonna have to defrost it so you get the most efficient running of your freezer. You want to choose a freezer that's well insulated. This will further cut your energy costs. And you want to locate it away from heat sources, because if you put it near a vent or something and the heat's running, you're going to be working at cross purposes to yourself. You want to freeze your food in small batches. You want to add no more than 3 pounds at a time. So you don't want to freeze everything in a huge freezer bag. You want to use smaller bags. And you want to help maintain that freezer by cleaning the motor housing and the condenser coils every 3 to 4 months. You want to check the tightness of the rubber gaskets that seal the door. And the way you check it is you place a sheet of paper or a dollar bill between them and attempt to pull it out. If it comes out easily, you're going to need to replace that gasket. If it stays in, if you have to struggle to pull it out, or if you can't get it out, or if you rip it, then you got a good tight seal. Now, as I said earlier, freezing slows down but does not completely stop microbial deterioration. When you thaw that food, then the bacteria are kicked into action and they start to grow again. That's why when you thaw frozen food, you want to do it slowly in your refrigerator, not on your kitchen counter at room temperature, because then those bacteria will start growing rapidly, and you may come down with a case of salmonella. I've had that. It is not fun. Now, you want to be sure to pre-treat your vegetables before you freeze them. There's 3 ways you can do it: either blanching with steam, boil blanching, or microwave blanching. Steam blanching will give you the best taste after freezing and the most protection against vitamin loss. In order to steam blanch, you want to bring 4 to 5 inches of water to a boil, and then put the vegetables in a steamer basket and place them over that boiling water, and then start timing it when you put the lid on the steamer. Boil blanching is very easy to do, but the high temperature and the soaking in water diminishes the flavor and the vitamins. In order to boil blanch, you want to bring 4 quarts of water to a rapid boil, add about 1 pound of clean pared vegetables, then let the water return to a boil, and then start timing it. Microwave blanching, you want to follow the manufacturer's directions. There's differing opinions as to just how effective microwave blanching is. You only want to use 1 plastic pint or quart-sized bag of vegetables at a time in order to get the most out of it. After you blanch your vegetables, you want to plunge them into ice cold water. This will stop the cooking process. If you want to freeze tomatoes, there's 2 different ways to freeze it. You can either stew them or cook them down in the oven. You can use a slow cooker or a saucepan. And then you can either freeze them whole, you can freeze them peeled, or you can freeze them unpeeled. Another way that you can freeze tomatoes is to wash about 12 to 24 tomatoes of uniform size. Then you want to remove the core, put them on a cookie sheet in the freezer. When they freeze solid, then put them in a plastic freezer bag. And then to thaw them, you want to spray them with a shower of warm water. You can skin fresh tomatoes first by what's known as scalding, which you do is you plunge them in boiling water for about 30 to 60 seconds, take them out, and then the skin should just come off very easily. Just a word of caution. Once you freeze tomatoes, you cannot unfreeze them and use them fresh. You have to use them in some kind of dish, because a frozen tomato does not turn into a fresh tomato once it defrosts. Two ways that you can freeze fruit: you can either dry pack it or wet pack. To dry pack fruits, dry packing is the easiest way to freeze fruit. You don't need any other liquids or any other ingredients. You wash it, put it on a clean towel, and handle it carefully so you don't bruise it. and spread them in a single layer on a cookie sheet and put it in your freezer. And then when that fruit is solid, put it in clean containers. And then to make sure that you're not losing any flavor or color, freeze them directly in containers, and you can bypass the cookie sheet if you think that if the cookie sheet method has caused loss of flavor in the past. Wet packing involves basically adding sugar, syrup, juice, or just regular table sugar or honey. All right, let's talk about pickling. Pickles, relishes, and chutneys can accessorize a meal. Chutneys and relishes go well with spicy foods like meat curries or foods with Cajun seasoning. Pickles are a something extra that can improve the flavor and presentation of a simple sandwich. I mean, just think, you make your own pickles, you make yourself a classic Chicago hot dog, and put a slice of your very own homemade pickles on there. It's good. Now, there's 4 different types of pickled products. There's fresh packed, and there's fruit pickles, there's chutneys and relishes, and then salt cured or brined pickles. You always want to make sure to use the freshest ingredients when pickling. Once again, your produce should be firm, ripe, and solid. If you're harvesting your fruits or vegetables from your own garden, do it on a sunny day. You want to handle it carefully to avoid bruising. You want to wash everything thoroughly before you start. Whatever spices or herbs you're using should be fresh. And then to properly flavor the pickled produce, you want to tie those spices once again in a cheesecloth or butter muslin bag, and then soak them in the vinegar or brine. Vinegar is an essential ingredient when it comes to pickling. Vinegar preserves the pickles by preventing the growth of bacteria. The vinegar should be at least 5% acidity. The best vinegars to use are your aged vinegars. The type of vinegar is also important. Fancy salad and balsamic vinegars don't contain enough acid for pickling. Best types of vinegars to use are red wine, white wine, and cider. Cider vinegar, however, can discolor light-colored vegetables such as cauliflower. Also, for making just plain old ordinary pickled cucumbers, good old white vinegar is also acceptable. You may want to experiment with some of the cider vinegars and others, just to see what kind of flavor profile it gives. Water, again, should be of the drinking quality. If your water is hard and mineral laden, you'll want to use distilled water. If you don't want to spend money on distilled water, what you can do is take your tap water, put it in a pot, boil it for about 10 minutes. This tends to drive out a lot of the chloride and other things, and then let it cool, and then you can use it. Again, canning or pickling salt is the best to use. Avoid those other salts, like I mentioned. Cold storage. Essentially, what you're doing with cold storage is you're placing the foods in a cool, dark environment with humidity that tends to vary. Temperature and humidity are the most important factors in cold storage. Some foods require air that's moist, others prefer air that's a little bit drier. Some fruits and vegetables need warmer temperature, others need colder temperatures. You have to take both of these things into account when you're deciding on the proper form, the proper method of cold storage that you're going to use. Here's some different ways that you can cold store your foods. The classic root cellar takes advantage of cool, moist temperatures in the earth to preserve food. The temperature of a root cellar should be about 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity should be about 80%. If your basement has a dirt floor and you don't have enough humidity down there, you can wet that dirt floor. That'll put some humidity in there. With a cement floor, you can either wet it or place pans of water, or you can purchase a small humidifier. You may want to invest in a good thermometer and also a hygrometer, so you can continually measure the temperature and the humidity. If you want to spend big bucks, you can buy yourself what's known as a sling psychrometer. This is like a double hygrometer, which contains a wet bulb and a dry bulb. You note the humidity measurement in the dry bulb, then you take the little rope on it and swing it around like you're an Argentinian gaucho, And then look at what the humidity is with the wet bulb, and the difference is the room humidity. That's a little bit too much work. Most house foundations have air ducts that can be opened and closed as needed to vary the temperature and humidity. So if you've got a basement or whatever, if you've got an air duct, you can kind of open those ducts if it's too humid and close them if it's not humid enough. To build a small storage area, you want to choose a spot away from the heat of your furnace or the heat of your chimney. The north wall of your house, of your basement, is usually the best, especially the northeast corner wall. You can regulate the temperatures with the foundation vent. In the fall or the spring, when the outside temperatures increase in the daytime, you want to keep that vent closed. When the outside temperatures drop due to freezing in the evening, you want to close that vent immediately. Other methods of cold storage: an outside stairway. If you have a basement that leads to the outside steps can be used to store your root crops. You can set pans of water on the steps to keep the air moist, or if you can somehow work a humidifier in there, that's another way you can do it. This method works well for root crops, apples, and pears. An ice chest, a styrofoam ice chest, works well for apples and green tomatoes. As long as you can store it in an unheated place that's not going to freeze, these coolers will work well for a short period of time. The biggest benefit of using the ice chest method is that it's portable. You don't have to have a dedicated thing that's heavy to move around, that you have to dig. Window wells are great for cold storage. You can store the food here in either covered baskets, buckets, wooden boxes, coolers, or cans. The temperature, however, is not as consistent as in a cellar storage area. However, you can vary the temperature by opening and closing the window in the well. You want to cover the window well with wood or screening. This keeps out sunlight and large pests and buffers the outside temperature. This will not, however, keep out field mice or rodents. So you may have to take that into account. Underground storage involves placing the produce in a container, which is then completely or partially buried underground. Whatever kind of container you use, you want to insulate it with 3 inches of clean sand on the bottom and a finishing layer on the top. You want to layer the produce between 3-inch layers of clean sand. So you have a 3-inch layer of clean sand, put some produce, another 3-inch layer, more produce, et cetera, et cetera. Underground storage can be done either in wooden barrels or wooden boxes. With a wooden barrel, you want to partially bury it in the ground and slope the soil away from it to prevent the groundwater from running in. You want that stuff to run off, not in. And you want to cover it with plastic sheeting in order to keep the rain and the snow out. In a wooden box, you want to wrap it with hardware cloth to keep out the pests, the vermin. And again, you want to slope it away from where you've got that box stored to keep out the groundwater, and then cover it with a secure wooden lid. You can also do underground storage in galvanized garbage cans. These are pest-proof. They're effective as long as you can handle that produce carefully. You want to cover the top of that garbage can with plastic sheeting and then 6 inches of straw, depending on how cold your climate is. You may need to cover it with more straw in order, if you have colder winter weather, and you can use the straw in the spring for mulch for your garden. Using a straw bale storage is excellent to store produce above ground. This is practical only in areas that have fairly mild winters. I don't think we have mild winters over here, although with climate change, that may not be true anymore. You want to choose a well-drained location. In order to be safe, you want to dig a trench around your straw bale storage site to keep out the rainwater. You want to build a rectangle of straw bales, approximately 2 bales long and about 1 bale wide. And then lay the bales end to end, line the floor with about 3 inches of loose straw, and then line it again with hardware cloth or place the food in covered wooden boxes to keep out the critters. And then put the produce in layers with about 3 inches of loose straw between each layer. And you want to top it off with another layer of loose straw and then close the pit or the box with more hardware cloth or a wooden top. And then place 2 straw bales over the top and then prop them up with bricks or stones to let the air circulate. If the weather gets too cold, then remove those and close it completely. Straw bale storage is ideal for storing carrots, beets, potatoes, and turnips. Some different materials that you can use for cold storage. Containers, this would be wooden boxes or crates, sturdy cardboard cartons, styrofoam coolers, barrels, baskets, plastic or metal trash cans and buckets, no lids. These are shallow, so they should be shallow so the weight of the top produce does not crush the stuff on the bottom. You don't want to have too much on the top, because what you take from the bottom will be mush. Mesh bags or slatted bins also work well for containers. Packing materials for cold storage. This can be things like clean sand, newspapers, fresh sawdust, clean dry leaves, straw or peat moss. All are good materials for cold storage. Now, one interesting thing I'll mention, if you want to try to cold store tomatoes, are varieties of tomatoes that are known as storage tomatoes. One excellent example is the Burpee Longkeeper. These are tomatoes that have been especially bred to have tougher skins, they ripen slower, and are much better for cold storage. You can put them in your basement or root cellar, and they have been known to last for a good 3 months. So if you have a hankering for fresh tomatoes in February, just go to your root cellar and get one. And when all your neighbors are having to deal with store-bought tomatoes, you can basically enjoy your fresh tomato and just look at them and, gloat, good old nanny. And that, my friends, is preserving the harvest in a nutshell. And I will now open the floor for questions. Or open the screen for questions. What do we have, Megan?
Pull up the chat here.
I've used the oven method for drying parsley. Had a bumper crop a few years ago. I didn't even plant the parsley.
Yay, rah.
You don't have to do the whole, put it in a metal pan and stir it. I just took it out of the oven after it was dry and put it in Ziploc bags.
Okay, if that works for you, that's fine. Again,
It got very crispy, type of thing. So I got it very, very dry. Yeah.
yeah. So if it was that dry, then you may not have needed to condition it.
Yeah.
But if you're not sure, and if you're drying something other than parsley, conditioning might be good again.
Because I've never done anything other than the crispy stuff in the oven, because I couldn't control the temperature quite so well, like you said. So I just went for the crispy stuff. I think I did basil that way.
Okay.
I think I did some onions one.
And you want to be careful that you're not over drying it, because then you're
And that
going to
was
lose the
the
flavor.
problem. Like,
Yeah.
I just stuck with the basics, we'll do the basil and the parsley, I got a bumper crop.
And conditioning and using everything that I talked about, this gives the greatest assurance that what you're going to get is not only going to be successfully dried, but flavorful as well.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I think I tried apples that way. I could do it, but they came out very crispy. I had apple crisp.
and if you want your apples a little less crispy and a little more flavorful, again, I recommend giving some of what I talked about a try.
Exactly.
What have we got for questions from our online community?
I don't have any questions online right now.
Oh,
I do have a question for you
Yes.
though. What is your favorite thing to can? Your favorite vegetable, fruit, or favorite method?
good old dill pickles. I grow my own cucumbers. If you want to grow your own cucumbers, I recommend there's a variety. You can purchase it from Gurney's Seed and Nursery. It's called Miss Pickler. It's an all-female variety. It's a very prolific cucumber. You get a lot. The only thing you have to, I caution you about is if you're growing your own cucumbers for pickling, you've got to stay on top of it, because if you wait too long, those cucumbers will grow too big to fit in the can. You'll have to cut them up. I like to can them whole, pickle them whole as much as possible. So I live in a townhome, so I don't have a lot of space for a garden. But fortunately, I have a good friend. She and her husband have graciously allowed me to garden in their backyard. So I'm really not a gardener, I'm a sharecropper. But she lives 15 minutes away from me, so I have to go over there like at least once a week and check on the cucumbers once they start producing. Otherwise, if I wait too long, I've got a big thing, and if I wait even longer, I've got a big orange thing that's not suitable for anything except the garbage or the compost pile. So that was a long-winded answer, but did I answer your question? Yeah. I included in your handouts, but I have a great recipe for pickles that comes from Food Canada. The recipe is very simple. It is water, pickling salt, vinegar, a couple of cloves of garlic, a sprig of dill, and your cucumbers. And you basically boil the brine, you pour it into the jars with the cucumbers and the garlic and the dill. Then you process it in your water bath canner for about 15 minutes. Sometimes I'll do 20 minutes because I'm really, really scared of that botulism. And I've been doing this for years. I haven't killed anybody yet. So, but yeah, that's a great recipe. And if anybody's interested, if they want to leave me their email address, I'd be happy to send that. Or I can send that to you and you can send that to whoever would be interested.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Other questions?
What's a good way for freezing a lot of basil?
Good way for freezing a lot of basil. Again, the question is, what's a good way to freeze a lot of basil? Again, I would follow what I mentioned earlier, freeze it in small packages and follow one of the methods that I talked about. Process it, blanch it, and then put it in the bags and freeze it slowly. So again, don't try to freeze it all in one huge bag. So that's what I would recommend. Other questions?
How can you know how you can pumpkin puree at home? Because my favorite thing to grow is pumpkins. And when I looked it up, it said you can't use the cold, or you can't use the water bath method because you can't get it to the correct temperature in the middle. And it said the commercial equipment. So do you know how to do that at home?
The question is what to do with pumpkin puree. Well, what I do with pumpkin puree is I will generally freeze it. It'll last about a good 6 months before you have to throw it away. But I don't necessarily can pumpkin puree. If I was to can it, if they say that the water bath method isn't so good, then I would go with a pressure canner. What I do with pumpkin puree is I used to grow my own pumpkins, but they took up so much space and they interfered with everything else I was growing. And now I just buy a pumpkin from a farmer's market. I'll slice it in half. I'll cook it in the oven for about an hour or so, scrape out the flesh, puree it in a food processor, and then I'll maybe put about a quarter of it in the refrigerator because I'm going to use it fairly quickly to make pumpkin soup. The rest I'll put in the freezer and I'll use it later to make things like pumpkin chocolate chip bread and other things. Again, it was a long-winded answer, but the basic answer I'll give you is use either a pressure canner or freeze it. That's how I would store pumpkin puree.
I'm glad to hear you like pumpkin soup. Finally, someone else though. People don't.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that. The first time I brought pumpkin soup to a Thanksgiving dinner, my mother was, oh, I don't know if I want to try it. But in a reverse parent method, I just said, Mom, try it. You'll like it. And she was finally, she tasted it and she said, oh, this is very good. And even my niece and nephew, who used to be finicky about foods, even they liked it. So yes, pumpkin soup rules.
Does. I like pumpkin.
I've never tried to make that, but now
It's got beans and jalapenos and tomatoes.
you know, I'm so glad you said something because I've got a lot of dried beans left over from past garden harvests. So now I can make pumpkin chili with farmer's market pumpkin and my own bean seeds. Thank you.
Well,
Hello, Mark. This is Marcia Herrick online. Yes. My husband made some, excuse me, some grape jam, and I would like to know how long it lasts. They are in the refrigerator right now, but how long would you think they should be there?
How long should you keep grape jam? That's a good question. I would say probably if you haven't used it in about a month or two, you might want to consider throwing it away. Also, if you look at the top of the jam and if you start to see any kind of mold buildup or anything, then I would definitely throw it away, because once you see that mold at the top, it's all the way through and you can no longer use it. Now, the good news with jam and jelly is that because there's so much sugar in there, that's too concentrated a solution, and any mold or bacteria that would initially grow, it would basically draw the moisture out of the bacteria. So that's why jellies and jams are a good way to preserve grapes and other things. But I would, just to be on the safe side, keep it no longer than a month or two.
They were, excuse me, they were put in special jars
Okay.
for freezing. Is that the same or?
Okay, if you're freezing it, you didn't say that earlier. In the refrigerator, I wouldn't keep it for more than a month or so. In the freezer, you can keep it for a good long time. Just to be on the safe side, I would say maybe 6 months in the freezer.
Okay. I also have another question. It's not really based on on your presentation, but maybe you would have some information to give. I'm trying to keep wild animals like squirrels, mice away from my garden, rabbits.
Oh.
Is there a way of, I don't want to do any harm to them because I love them. I just wanted to have my garden there. So do you have any tips or anything that's...
Yes. The question is, how do I keep the vermin away from my garden? Depending on what kind of pests you're talking about, critters, there's different ways. Rabbits, you can keep away with a 6-foot-high galvanized steel fence around your garden. You want to be sure to sink that fence about 6 inches below ground to keep the rabbits from tunneling under. Other ways that you can keep rabbits away: sprinkle dried blood meal around the garden. This tends to repel them. You can use hot pepper wax. Hot pepper wax you can buy at any nursery, or you can get it online. You basically spray it on your fruits and vegetables, and if the rabbit or squirrel takes a bite out of it, it would be like you biting into a Carolina Reaper pepper. Just have to be sure to wash those fruits and vegetables thoroughly, so that you don't eat any of that stuff yourself. Mice can be difficult to keep out. Again, a good fence might keep them away. Hot pepper wax. You can spray, there's a product called Repels All that you can spray around the edge of your garden. That's like a rotten egg garlic preparation. If the odor is offensive to you, multiply that by about 1,000, which is about how much more sensitive sense of smell critters have. And you can imagine what it would be like for them. For squirrels can be very difficult to keep away because those little buggers are smart and they can climb. Some different things you can try: vinegar-soaked rags. Mothballs, take a few mothballs, poke a hole in them with a needle or with a nail or whatever, thread a needle through them, tie string, and then thread that through a Solo cup or a Dixie cup, and then hang that in your garden. That works as a double way. The odor should drive them away, plus the rattling of the cup and the mothballs in the wind, the noise can also scare them away. Other things you can do is you can encourage some of their natural predators. Make your yard habitable for snakes, because snakes eat a lot of mice. Frogs and toads eat a lot of insects. If you happen to live in an area where you've got hawks and owls, try to, make it friendly for them to come into your yard. I've often said one way you can keep away the critters is to take up the sport of falconry. Get yourself a hawk and an owl. The hawk will get them by day, the owl will get them by night. What else can be used? Another thing you can do is for squirrels is bribery. Set up a squirrel feeder somewhere away from your garden, buy some squirrel corn and fill the feeder with that. The idea being that the squirrels will fill up on the corn you're feeding them and they'll be too full to go after your garden vegetables. It's kind of like paying protection to the mafia, but it might work. I kind of stumbled on this by accident. One year I was growing corn and I also grew sunflowers at the same time. They just happened to mature around the same time. And the squirrels went after the sunflowers and left the corn alone. And I had one of the best crops I had in years. Covering up certain, the fruits, the corn, the veggies or whatever might also help. If you can put like separate fences around, whatever you're growing. Maybe you have a separate fence off of your tomatoes, put it on the top as well as around the sides. That will keep them away. That fence will have to be made out of metal because I've discovered they can chew through plastic. If you're trying to grow corn, this is an extreme measure, but it works. You have to hand pollinate the ears, cover the ears with socks, and then use rebar wire and lash them to the stalks that way. Like I said, it's an extreme method, but it works. I did that last year, and I had one of the best corn harvests I ever had. This year, the corn grew so puny that I didn't even care that the squirrels got after it. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you're using repellent methods, dried blood, vinegar-soaked rags, hot pepper wax, repels all, you have to vary it. Predator urine is another way of keeping them away, but you have to vary it. If you use the same thing day in, day out, week after week, eventually the animals get wise. They're not completely stupid. So you have to use like predator urine 1 week, and maybe in another week or so, use dried blood. Then maybe set up a phony owl to scare them away or a phony snake, and then take that away after a week and use something else. Keep them off balance, because if you just use, once again, say you just use nothing but predator urine, eventually the squirrel or the rabbit would figure out, well, I'm smelling the predator urine, but I don't see a coyote or a fox anywhere around. Hey guys, party in Mr. McGregor's garden. So I hope this gives you some different ideas, things you can try to keep them away. I'm with you. I don't want to shoot them. I don't want to hurt them. On the other hand, I do not feel obligated to share with them. So yeah. I have no problems about repelling them or blocking them in any way possible. What else can I tell you? That's basically it for how to keep the critters out. I have in my presentation on power vegetable gardening, growing terrific tomatoes, and specifically controlling garden marauders. Those are 3 presentations I do where I specifically address those garden marauders and keeping them out of your garden. So feel free to check out my website, which by the way is on the screen over here, along with my other contact methods. And when those classes come up, you can either take them live or online, depending on where I'm speaking, and that will give you more information. I would tell you more, but I don't have all my other notes with me right now, but that should give you a good start.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Other questions?
What's the way for preserving a lot of peppers? I have hot peppers, I got sweet peppers, small ones, long ones, Italian.
With peppers, I would say using either pressure canning. You can try freezing some of those.
It'd be like cutting the top off and pulling the seeds out.
Yeah.
Freezing them up that
Yeah, that way. You could try drying, especially with some of the hotter peppers. That works. You can make like dried chilies and other things like that. What kind of peppers do you grow?
My wife bought a bunch of different plants and put them in and said, okay, fine. So I've got some nice long sweet Italian ones. There's something like a habanero, there's a real hot red one, that's some, I think my son said something like from the 70,000 SHU.
Oh, Scoville units?
And there's a variety of small sweet peppers.
Okay. Well, now, one thing I'll just say about your wife's buying method, and this is no slur on her or anything, but one of the things I always tell people is that you don't want to put anything in your garden unless you know something about it. One of the questions I often get is something like, Mark, my peppers didn't grow, or my tomatoes didn't do so well. What should I do? And the first question I'll always ask them is, what cultivar did you plant? And they'll usually say, oh, I don't know. I just went to Walmart and bought what they had. Or my wife just stuck them in the ground and said, have at it. And if you don't know what you've grown, you don't know if it failed, and you don't know what you did wrong, or what you planted might not have been suitable for your particular soil conditions, environmental conditions. But if you don't know what you planted, you wouldn't know that. On the flip side, if you got great success, you want to be able to duplicate that. But if you don't know what you've planted, then you don't know what to get the next time you go in the spring to buy your peppers and your seeds and your plants. So it's a good idea to always know what you've planted, to be able to say, I'm growing a habanero pepper, or I'm growing a Better Boy tomato, or I'm growing a Miss Pickler cucumber. Because I've known what I'm planting, I know what its conditions are, I know what its requirements are. And if it doesn't do well, I can say, okay, the Better Boy tomato didn't do so well in my garden, so I know I don't want to plant that variety next year. So I would tell your wife that next time she buys peppers, make note of what she's buying, the variety that she's buying, so that if it succeeds, you'll know you want to plant it again. If it doesn't, you'll know that you don't want to plant it again.
That makes sense.
Yes, and I'm pretty anal about my garden when I plant it. I not only make sure I choose my varieties, but I will actually sketch out my garden on squared graph paper, and I will scale it. 1 inch equals 2 feet. So I know exactly how much space I have in my garden, what I can plant, and how far apart I need to plant it. Again, that's a bit anal, but it does work.
Makes sense.
Other questions? Well, if there, yes.
Does anyone here or you know anyone by chance that has a heated greenhouse around here? Because something on my bucket list is to try growing bananas. Thought that'd be really cool to attempt. So I don't know anyone, but I just thought I'd ask.
I'm afraid I don't either. If I did, I would certainly want to buy it from them, or maybe buy time or whatever. It's funny you mentioned growing bananas. I want to grow a cacao bean tree, have my own chocolate.
That'd be awesome.
Or vanilla bean orchids and make my own vanilla extract. But I don't know anybody that has a greenhouse for sale. If I did, I'd be saving up my pennies. Yeah, if anybody knows anybody, or if anybody has a greenhouse of their own that they want to sell, contact, what's your name?
Nolan?
Contact Nolan over there. Get in touch with him, and or better yet, get in touch with me. If you've got two, get in touch with both of us. One for Nolan, one for me.
Well, I'm not really in the market to buy one. I'm just probably gonna try to ask them if I can, in exchange for some labor or some amount of money. Try
That's
to
a good
use
idea.
the space in the greenhouse to grow a banana plant in the pot.
You brought up something that I also talk about in my gardening classes, or I've talked about on a blog, is using, if you don't have enough space for a garden of your own, use what I like to call OPS, other people's space. If you have a friend or a relative, friend of a relative, or a relative of a friend, or somebody that's willing to let you have some space, whether it's in their backyard or their greenhouse, to try to grow something, you want to treat that space very carefully. It's like using credit. You always want to make sure to pay them back, whether you give them some of the harvest, or make sure that you clean up what you've done, get the weeds out of there. If it's a greenhouse, clean up your area, clean up any spills or anything like that. Treat it as if it were your own. So that was a long-winded answer, but unfortunately, I don't know anybody with a greenhouse. If I did, I'd probably keep it for myself. No, I'm just kidding. But if anybody does, contact Nolan. Other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, first of all, if you want to get in contact with me, here's all my different contact sites. You can call me, you can check out my website, you can email me, you can like me on Facebook, you can follow me on Google, check out my blog, follow me on Twitter, Instagram, or link up with me on LinkedIn. My business is Green Thumb at your service. I teach people how to grow more and better vegetables, and I give presentations and teach classes like this one over here. And I also have a book for sale. It's called Gardening with Confidence. For a mere $5, you can take me, you can take the book home. I cost a little bit more. I also do one-on-one consulting. So if you have a garden problem and you need some professional advice, call me up. I'll come out to your place, we'll look over the garden, and I'll give you some advice. So, if there are no more questions,
Get out a machine gun from his violin case.
I will leave you with this. When the gardener comes around and he's digging in the ground, the gardener is the one who knows it all. If you'll only look and see, I think you will agree. The gardener is the one who knows it all. The gardener is the one, the gardener is the one who grows tomatoes through the fall. And they're tasty and they're sweet, and you know they can't be beat. The gardener is the one who knows it all. The gardener is the one, the gardener is the one, grows zucchini through the fall. And he's happy just to share with his friends and neighbors there, because his family simply cannot use it all. Yes, the gardener is the one who knows it all. Thank you.